I gave your trust fund to your stepbrother. He's better than you." Those were the exact words my stepmother spat at me over the phone, her voice dripping with satisfaction. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about money. This was about erasing me. My name is Lauren Carter, and for years I stayed silent while my stepmother, Victoria, manipulated my father, twisted the truth, and convinced everyone that I didn't matter. But when she tried to steal what my mother left me, she made the biggest mistake of her life. Because this time, I fought back. But the real question is, how far will someone go when they think they've already won? If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, this story is for you. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you've ever had to stand your ground, or let me know where you're watching from. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. The phone buzzed on my desk, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. I stared at it for a second, debating whether to answer. I almost didn't. But then, deep in my gut, I knew. Victoria Carter. She rarely called unless she had something calculated to say, something she had already played over in her mind, savoring the moment she could deliver it. I sighed, knowing exactly what was coming, but I still pressed accept. "Lauren," she said, her voice smooth as ever, that sickly sweet tone she always used when she wanted something. "I thought you should hear it from me first." I didn't say anything. Silence unsettled her. I had learned that much over the years. "Your mother's trust fund? It belongs to Madison now. She deserves it more than you." The words punched through my chest, and yet I didn't let it show. Not this time. I sat up straighter, gripping the edge of my desk as the weight of her words settled in. Outside my office window, the Manhattan skyline stretched far into the horizon. The city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the fire now simmering beneath my skin. "That's all you have to say?" she asked when I remained silent. "No screaming, no fighting, just acceptance?" I let the pause linger. She expected me to unravel, for anger to choke my voice, for desperation to seep through. But I had learned to control my emotions around Victoria long ago. "Thank you for letting me know," I said, my voice even, detached. There was a brief silence on the other end. I imagined her sitting in the grand dining room of my father's house, lips pursed, fingers gripping the phone a little too tightly. She hadn't expected this. "Excuse me?" she finally said. "You heard me." "You ungrateful little—" she started, her voice tightening with frustration. "Is there anything else?" I cut her off, still calm. I wasn't going to let her win. "Madison needs that money," Victoria continued, her voice shifting, trying a new approach. "She's getting married, buying a house, starting a life. Unlike you, she's actually doing something meaningful. You'd only waste it on your career." I swallowed hard, my free hand clenching into a fist. My career was not meaningless. Victoria had spent years undermining my accomplishments, twisting my successes into something unworthy, something selfish. I had built my life without the trust fund, without my father's acknowledgement, and certainly without Victoria's approval. And yet she still found a way to make it seem like I was the one taking up too much space. "I have a flight to catch," I said, pushing my chair back and standing. "Of course you do," she scoffed, running away, as usual. I hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, my breath coming in slow, measured beats. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from something sharper, colder. Rage. Victoria thought she had won, that she had finally erased my mother's legacy, wiped me out of the picture for good. But she had no idea what was coming. I grabbed my phone again and dialed a familiar number. "Samuel Hayes," my lawyer answered, his voice crisp, professional. "She made her move," I said. There was a brief pause. Then, "And?" "It's time," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. He didn't need further explanation. I leaned against my desk, staring at the city beyond the glass, my mind already piecing together my next move. I had been waiting for this, preparing for it. Victoria thought I was an obstacle she could finally push aside. She was wrong. I pulled my laptop toward me and booked the earliest flight home. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about a trust fund. This was about principle, about justice, about making sure my mother's final gift to me wasn't stolen by the woman who had spent years trying to erase her. Victoria had drawn the battle lines, believing I would let her win. She had no idea that I was about to fight harder than she ever imagined. People think stepmothers belong in fairy tales. Some are wicked, some are kind. Mine was calculated. She didn't storm in like a villain, nor did she try to win me over with fake kindness. She didn't need to. Victoria was smarter than that. She played the long game, slowly, quietly, deliberately. She was like a slow poison seeping into the walls of my home, infiltrating everything that once felt safe, until I woke up one day and realized nothing was mine anymore. I was 16 when my father married her. 2 years had passed since my mother's death, but the grief still clung to me like a shadow. I wasn't ready for someone new, for change, for a woman who smiled too much and spoke in careful, calculated words that always seemed to mean more than what she said. Victoria entered our penthouse like she belonged there. She didn't just move in, she took over. At first, it was small things. My mother's favorite vase disappeared. The soft throw blankets she used to wrap around me were replaced with cold designer ones. The scent of lavender, which used to linger in the air from my mother's perfume, was replaced with something sharper, muskier, Victoria's signature scent. And then the changes became bigger. The paintings my mother had chosen for the walls were replaced. The furniture was rearranged. Even the staff that had been with us for years were slowly let go, one by one, replaced by people loyal to her. It was subtle, methodical, a slow erasure of everything my mother had built. My father let it happen. Maybe he was too deep in his grief to notice, or maybe he just wanted to forget. And Victoria? She made sure I noticed. Madison was 13 when they moved in, and from the very first day, she was treated like a princess returning to her rightful palace. Victoria's world revolved around her. Every conversation, every decision, every tiny inconvenience Madison faced became the center of our lives. "She's had a harder life than you, Lauren," Victoria would say, her tone syrupy sweet, disguising the venom underneath. "She didn't grow up with the privileges you had. We have to make things fair." Fair. Victoria loved that word, but nothing about our lives was fair. Fair was watching Madison get a standing ovation for getting a B on her math test, while my straight A's went unnoticed. Fair was Madison receiving designer handbags for turning in her school project, while my father barely looked up when I won a statewide business competition. Fair was Madison being showered with affection, attention, and praise, while I slowly became invisible. Victoria never needed to say I didn't belong. She just made it clear with every action, every whisper in my father's ear, every moment she chose to lift Madison up while stepping over me. And my father? He let her. Whether he was too blinded by grief or simply too willing to believe Victoria's carefully constructed narrative, I don't know. But I do know this. He never fought for me. And that was the worst part of all. By the time I turned 18, I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. I had worked hard, harder than I should have had to, earning scholarships, building a future that didn't rely on anyone. I was accepted into one of the top business schools in the country. Not that my father noticed. Not that anyone noticed. The day I packed my bags, there was no teary goodbye, no heartfelt apology, no sudden realization from my father that he had let me down. Victoria stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching me like a queen watching a servant exit her palace for the last time. "Don't expect us to come running if you fail," she said, her voice smooth, unbothered. I looked her dead in the eye. "I won't." And then I walked out. For years, I never looked back. I built a life on my own. No help, no trust fund, no family. I told myself I was free. But now Victoria had gone too far. She thought I had forgotten how to fight. She was wrong. You're saying she tried to transfer the trust fund, but failed? I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Samuel Hayes didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, steady, completely unsurprised. She tried, he confirmed, but the protections we put in place did exactly what they were supposed to do. The bank flagged the transaction and froze the account before a single dollar could move. I let out a slow breath, staring at the skyline beyond my office window. Relief should have flooded through me. It didn't, because this wasn't over. Victoria had finally made her move. She had thrown her first punch, but what she didn't know was that I had already seen it coming. And now she had just handed me the weapon I needed to take her down. Samuel's office was everything I expected it to be. Sleek, professional, designed for people who played the long game. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of Manhattan, a constant reminder of the power players who ran the world from behind desks like this one. The bookshelves were filled with legal arsenals, case law, corporate strategy, the secrets of the elite. This was where battles were won before they even began, and today it was where Victoria's empire started to crumble. I sank into the leather chair across from Samuel, my pulse steady, but my mind racing. He slid a folder across the polished surface of his desk. "Take a look," he said. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the neatly organized stack of documents. And there it was, the blueprint of Victoria's crime. She had created a shell company, a fake corporation, registered in my father's name, designed to make it look like he had authorized the transfer of my trust fund. A perfect financial illusion. It had almost worked. Almost. If she had succeeded, Samuel continued, the money would have been untraceable by now. But since the bank flagged it, we have evidence of attempted fraud. I stared at the fake signatures, the fabricated paperwork, the sheer boldness of it. Victoria hadn't just stolen. She had built an entire legal facade to justify it, and she had failed. She really thought she could get away with this, I murmured, shaking my head. Samuel smirked. She's gotten away with a lot, hasn't she? I swallowed hard. Yes, she had. For years, she'd manipulated her way through my family, rewriting our history, bending my father's loyalty in her favor, making me an outsider in my own home. And now, she had tried to erase the last thing my mother left for me. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. "What do you want to do next?" Samuel asked, watching me carefully. I shut the folder, my fingers tapping against the cover. "We make sure she can never try this again." "Good," he said, "because once she realizes she's trapped, she's going to fight back harder." He was right. Victoria never admitted defeat. Losing control wasn't an option for her. She had spent years orchestrating every detail of our family's life, molding my father into a man who couldn't see past her carefully crafted lies. And now she was about to feel what it was like to be powerless. "She won't see it coming," I murmured. "No," Samuel agreed. "She won't." I thought back to every slight, every dismissal, every moment she made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. Every time I won something and no one cared. Every time Madison was celebrated for things I had done 100 times better. Every time my father had looked at me and seen a burden, while he looked at Victoria and saw salvation. She had spent years convincing him that I didn't matter. Now I was about to prove just how wrong she was. "I won't just protect the money," I said, voice firm. "I'm going to expose her for who she really is." Samuel nodded, a glint of something almost amused in his eyes. "Then let's get started." That night, I packed my bags. For years, I had built a life away from them, away from the house where I had once felt like a stranger, away from the family that had never felt like mine. I told myself I had moved on, that I didn't need revenge, that I didn't care. I had been lying to myself. Victoria thought she had won. She had no idea I was coming for her. Victoria's eyes flickered with something close to panic when she saw me step into the Carter penthouse. I smiled. Let the games begin. The penthouse gleamed under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, casting elegant reflections off the towering windows that overlooked the city skyline. The air smelled of expensive champagne and carefully curated floral arrangements, the kind designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. This was Victoria's domain, a carefully constructed illusion of power, wealth, and absolute control. Every detail of the evening was flawless. The guests, New York's wealthiest, my father's business partners, the socialites Victoria so desperately wanted to be among, were all gathered in elegant clusters, sipping wine, exchanging pleasantries. It was exactly the kind of setting she thrived in, and I was about to tear it apart. I moved through the crowd slowly, deliberately, making my presence known. I could feel the eyes on me, some familiar, some curious. The estranged daughter returning after years away. Victoria was still across the room speaking to a group of guests, but her entire posture had shifted the moment she saw me. She was no longer relaxed, no longer effortlessly in control. She was watching me. Closely. Good. "Lauren," she finally said, stepping toward me with a carefully crafted smile. What a surprise. I tilted my head, taking a slow sip of my champagne. "Is it?" Her smile stayed in place, but I saw it. The flicker of doubt, the tightening of her grip on her glass. She didn't expect me to be here. "I didn't think you'd make it," she continued smoothly, her voice a polished veneer of warmth. "Oh, I wouldn't have missed it," I said, scanning the room. "Big night for you, isn't it? Hosting all these important people, keeping up appearances." Victoria's lips twitched, but she didn't break. Not yet. "Well, I do what I can," she said lightly, her voice laced with subtle condescension. "I'm sure you do," I murmured, swirling the champagne in my glass. I felt Madison watching from a few feet away. She wasn't part of the conversation, but I knew she was listening. There was something different in the way she looked at me tonight, like she knew deep down that something was wrong. And she was right. "I have to say, Victoria," I continued, shifting my weight casually, "I've been catching up on some fascinating financial records lately." Victoria barely blinked. "I'm sure you have." "One in particular stood out to me," I said. "A company, registered under my father's name. Completely fraudulent, of course." The air between us shifted. It was subtle, but I caught it. The tiniest flicker of surprise before she masked it with a laugh. "You must be mistaken, dear," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "Am I?" I asked, tilting my head, because the bank seemed pretty interested when they flagged the attempted transfer. The conversation around us started to slow. Guests turned their heads just slightly, pretending not to listen, but I knew they were hanging onto every word. Victoria let out another soft laugh, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lauren, darling," she said, a trace of irritation creeping into her voice, "I know being away for so long has made you out of touch, but these things are complicated. You wouldn't understand the financial side of your father's business." I smiled. "See, that's the thing," I said. "I do. And what I understand is that shell companies don't create themselves." The muscles in Victoria's jaw tensed. She was starting to realize. She didn't know how much I knew. And that was exactly where I wanted her. I glanced at my father. He was standing near the bar, deep in conversation with one of his investors, but his attention had drifted toward us. Good. "That's the thing about paper trails," I mused, my voice just loud enough for those closest to us to hear. "They always lead somewhere." Victoria's grip on her wine glass tightened. "I'm not sure what you're implying," she said coolly, but I could hear the strain in her voice. "Oh, I think you do," I said softly. I took a deliberate step forward, lowering my voice just enough for only her to hear. "I have the documents," I whispered. "Signed, sealed, and completely fraudulent." Victoria's breath hitched, and then, for the first time since I walked into this penthouse, she lost control. "What are you talking about?" My father's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The conversations around us halted. Victoria turned to him, her face carefully composed, but I saw it, the quick flicker of real fear. I turned to my father, meeting his gaze. For the first time in years, I had his full attention. "She didn't just try to take my trust fund, Dad," I said evenly. "She broke the law doing it." The room fell silent. I watched as the color drained from his face, as confusion and something dangerously close to doubt crossed his features. He turned to Victoria. "Tell me that's not true," he said, his voice quieter now. Victoria stiffened, and in that moment I saw it, the tiny fracture in her perfect armor. She clenched her jaw, forcing out a sharp breath, and when she turned back to me, her expression had hardened. This wasn't over. She wasn't done fighting. But neither was I. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria says smoothly, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. But I see the way her fingers tighten around her wine glass, how the tendons in her neck tense just slightly. She knows she's cornered. I take a slow step forward, my voice steady, unwavering. "Then you won't mind if I share some documents with everyone here." A ripple moves through the crowd. Quiet whispers, curious glances. The polite, orchestrated atmosphere of the evening shifts. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. It's a reckoning. The penthouse, once filled with the soft hum of champagne-fueled conversations, has turned into a silent courtroom. The guests, my father's business associates, longtime friends, a few well-connected socialites, stand still, watching. Even a few journalists invited to document what should have been another glamorous Carter gathering are now seeing something far more interesting. Madison stands near the staircase, arms folded, shifting uncomfortably. And my father, the man who had let Victoria pull the strings for years, is no longer standing at her side. I reach into my bag and pull out a stack of neatly bound documents. "These are the bank records," I say, my voice carrying across the room. "They show the attempted transfer of my trust fund into a shell company, a company that doesn't actually exist, except on paper." Victoria's expression doesn't change, but her grip on the glass does. I begin handing the papers out, one by one, to the most powerful people in the room. "Here are the fraudulent incorporation papers," I continue, "filed under my father's name, forged, of course." I meet my father's eyes as I set a copy in front of him. "And these," I add, flipping the final page, "are the failed transaction logs. Thanks to the safeguards we put in place, the bank caught it before the money disappeared." The silence in the room is thick. No one moves, no one speaks. And then, my father looks down at the papers in his hands. His face drains of color. "This is ridiculous," Victoria scoffs, letting out a sharp laugh. "Somehow you've misunderstood." "Misunderstood," I repeat, arching an eyebrow. "Then why does the fraud department at the bank seem so interested?" I pull out my phone, pressing play on the audio recording. Victoria's voice fills the room. "I don't care about the security measures. Override them. This is my husband's account, and I have the authority to make these changes." There's no mistaking it. It's her voice. It's her words. And now, everyone in this room has heard them. The weight of the revelation crashes down. A soft gasp escapes Madison's lips. One of my father's business associates clears his throat, shifting awkwardly. A journalist silently presses record on their phone. And my father... His fingers tremble around the documents. His chest rises and falls in deep, unsteady breaths. When he finally speaks, his voice is hoarse. "You lied to me." Victoria doesn't move. For years. Something inside her finally cracks. For the first time in her life, Victoria has no power left in the room. No one is rushing to defend her. No one is buying her carefully rehearsed lies. She's alone, and she knows it. A choked sob breaks through the silence. Madison. She stumbles backward, her face pale, her eyes glistening with tears. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." Victoria turns to her, but Madison shakes her head. "You always told me she was the selfish one," Madison whispers, her voice cracking, "that she was the problem. But it was you, wasn't it?" Victoria reaches for her, but Madison flinches away. Then, without another word, she runs. My father hesitates only for a moment before following after her, and me, I stay exactly where I am, standing in the center of the battlefield. I've won this battle, but I know one thing for certain. Victoria won't go down without a fight. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating furiously on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it, blinking against the early morning light streaming through the curtains. But the second my eyes focused on the screen, my breath caught in my throat. Lauren Carter, accused of embezzling family wealth. I sat up so fast that the sheets tangled around me. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the flood of notifications, headlines screaming my name in bold, capitalized letters. Heiress betrays her own father. Secret scheme exposed. Lauren Carter fabricated fraud allegations to steal millions, claims family source. Carter family scandal, the daughter who wanted it all. It was a full-scale attack, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Victoria. I threw on a jacket and made my way to my lawyer's office, my hands clenched into fists. Samuel had already seen the headlines by the time I arrived. He looked up from his desk, calm but calculating. "She moves fast," he muttered, sliding a printed article toward me. "She's hired one of the best crisis management teams in the city. They've already flipped the narrative. To the public, you're the villain now." I scanned the article, my stomach twisting. The lies were masterful. Victoria had painted herself as a devoted wife and stepmother, betrayed by a greedy, ungrateful daughter who wanted to steal her father's fortune. "She's not just trying to defend herself," I said, my voice tight. "She's trying to bury me." Samuel leaned back, folding his hands together. "She's desperate. You humiliated her in front of the people she spent years trying to impress. This is her counterattack." I exhaled sharply. I should have expected this. Victoria wasn't the type to surrender, not without burning everything down with her. "She's playing on emotion," Samuel continued, "and it's working. Your father hasn't made any statements. He's completely silent." I swallowed hard. I knew why. Because he wasn't sure who to believe. The penthouse was silent when I arrived. I stepped inside, my heels clicking against the marble floors, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The weight of my father's indecision hung thick in the air. Victoria was already waiting. She stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, a sad, weary expression carefully crafted onto her face. "Lauren," she said softly, shaking her head, "I don't understand. Why are you doing this to us?" I almost laughed. "To you?" I echoed, stepping forward. "You forged my father's signature. You tried to steal my trust fund, and now you want to pretend you're the victim?" She exhaled, shaking her head like a disappointed parent. "Sweetheart, you're confused. You always have been. You don't know how the real world works. That's why you lashed out, why you turned on your own family." I clenched my jaw. "I have proof." "So do I," she countered smoothly. And that was when I saw it. On the table beside her sat a thick stack of papers. Fabricated evidence, fake financial reports, manipulated numbers designed to make me look guilty. My stomach twisted. "You went to war with me, Lauren," Victoria said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "And you didn't think I'd fight back?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You have evidence," she admitted. "But what does that matter? The public loves a villain, and right now, that's you." She smirked, and for the first time, I saw the truth beneath her mask. She wasn't scared. She was enjoying this. Dad. The word felt heavy on my tongue as I turned toward him. He was sitting in his leather chair, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. He looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really believe her over me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then finally, he lifted his head. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. And just like that, my heart broke. For years, I had accepted that my father didn't see me the way I wished he did. But this hurt more than I could have imagined. I turned away, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Lauren," Victoria said, her voice softer now, "why don't we just make this go away? We don't have to fight, just step back and we can fix this." I laughed under my breath. "Fix this?" I echoed, turning to face her. "You don't want to fix anything, you just want me to lose." Her lips curled into something close to a smirk. "Isn't that what you did to me?" she whispered. I stared at her for a long moment. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Mom, stop." We both turned. Madison. She stood at the base of the staircase, hands trembling at her sides, her face pale. "Madison, sweetheart." Victoria started, but Madison shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I've been watching. I've seen everything. I know what you did." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. "You always told me Lauren was the problem," Madison whispered. "That she was selfish, that she only cared about money. But that was a lie, wasn't it?" Victoria's eyes flashed with something close to real fear. "Tell Dad the truth," Madison pressed. "Tell him everything." Victoria said nothing, because she couldn't. And then Madison did something I never expected. She pulled out her phone and hit play, a recording. Victoria's voice filled the room. "You have evidence, but what does that matter? The public loves a villain, and right now, that's you." My breath caught in my throat. Victoria's face turned white. My father stared at the phone, listening to the woman he had defended for years finally expose herself. And when the recording ended, he slowly turned to look at her. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria swallowed hard. "Richard, how long have you been lying to me?" The silence stretched thick between them, and then my father's jaw tightened. "Get out." Victoria's breath hitched. "Richard, I said get out." She flinched at the sudden force in his voice. For years she had controlled him, manipulated him. But now, she had finally lost. The court summons was delivered the next morning. Victoria may have been cast out, but I knew this wasn't over. Justice still needed to be served, and I was going to make sure it was. "Victoria Carter, you are being charged with financial fraud and attempted identity theft." The words echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom, crisp and final. I watched from my seat as Victoria stood before the judge, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For years, she had controlled everything and everyone around her. But today, she was just another defendant. The cameras flashed, reporters whispered, the world was watching, and I was ready to finish this fight. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, every journalist hungry for a headline. The Carter family scandal had become a media storm, and today was the climax. My father sat beside me, his posture stiff, his face pale but unreadable. Madison sat a few rows away, her hands folded in her lap, staring blankly ahead. She hadn't said much since she turned over the recording, since she exposed her own mother. I couldn't blame her. My gaze flickered toward Victoria. She sat still, her expression composed, but I could see it. The tightness in her jaw, the slight tremor in her fingers as she gripped the edge of the defense table. She knew. She was losing. Her lawyer stood next, smoothing his tie before addressing the jury. "My client," he said, "is not a criminal. She is a devoted wife and mother who has been maliciously targeted by a vengeful stepdaughter." I clenched my fists beneath the table. Lauren Carter, he continued, nodding toward me, has spent years resenting my client. And when she didn't get what she wanted, she fabricated this entire case to destroy the woman who raised her. I forced myself to stay still, stay calm, stay in control. I had expected this. Victoria's greatest weapon had always been twisting the truth, but not this time, because this time I had witnesses. Call your next witness. The courtroom doors opened and Madison stepped forward. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she walked toward the stand, her expression pale but determined. Victoria stiffened. I exhaled slowly. This was it. Madison took a seat, adjusting the microphone with shaking fingers. Please state your name for the court. Madison Carter. And your relation to the defendant? She hesitated for only a moment. She's my mother. Victoria sat perfectly still. Ms. Carter, the prosecutor continued, do you have any knowledge of the fraudulent activities in question? A long pause. Then Madison swallowed hard and said, yes. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Please elaborate, the prosecutor urged. Madison looked down at her hands. I used to believe everything my mom told me, she said quietly, that Lauren was selfish, that she wanted to take everything from us. But that wasn't true. She took a shaky breath. I saw things, heard things. My mom spent years convincing my dad that Lauren didn't deserve anything, that she was a burden. But the truth is, she turned toward Victoria, her voice breaking. She was the one trying to take everything. Victoria's face remained frozen, but I saw it, the flicker of real fear. Did your mother ever discuss the fraudulent company? The prosecutor asked. Madison hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I overheard her talking to her lawyer about it before Lauren found out. She thought she'd covered her tracks. She said she had everything under control. Victoria's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection, speculation. Overruled, the judge said. Madison turned toward my father. Dad, she whispered, her voice raw. She's been lying to you for years. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy fog, and for the first time, my father didn't look at Victoria with blind devotion. He looked at her like a stranger. No further questions, the prosecutor said. Madison stepped down. She didn't look at her mother as she passed. Victoria sat still, unmoving, but I saw the way her fingers gripped the table, white-knuckled, desperate. This was the moment she had feared most, the moment she lost control. The judge glanced at the jury, then back at Victoria. Victoria Carter, this court finds you guilty of financial fraud and attempted identity theft. The words hit like a hammer. A collective exhale rippled through the room. You are hereby sentenced to financial restitution of the stolen assets and permanently banned from managing financial accounts of any kind. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just watched as Victoria slowly turned toward me. For the first time in her life, the smug confidence was gone. There was no last-minute scheme, no final manipulation to pull. She had lost, and she knew it. The bailiff approached her, ready to escort her out. Victoria clenched her jaw, her eyes dark with something between fury and disbelief. "You think you've won?" she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I met her gaze. "I don't think," I murmured. "I know." She let out a slow breath, and then, for the first time, she looked away first. I turned back toward my father. He was staring down at the verdict, his hands trembling. He had spent years ignoring the truth. Now he couldn't escape it. As Victoria was led out of the courtroom, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Justice had been served, but I wasn't done yet. "What are you going to do with the trust fund now?" Madison asks quietly. She's sitting across from me in my office, her fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. I glance out the window at the Manhattan skyline, my city, my home, my fresh start. The war is over, but the scars remain. It had been a week since the trial ended, since Victoria had been led out of the courtroom, powerless for the first time in her life, since my father had looked at me, not as a disappointment, not as a burden, but as his daughter. But endings, even the just ones, never erase the past. They only clear the path for what comes next. I don't know yet, I admit, setting down my pen, but I know I don't want it to just sit there. My mother built this fund to give me choices, to give me freedom. Maybe it can do the same for others. Madison looks down, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "You're not going to disappear again, are you?" she asks, barely above a whisper. I exhale. "No," I say softly. "Not this time." Her shoulders relax, just a little. I study her face, so much younger than mine, yet carrying the same weight of betrayal. She had spent her life believing her mother's lies, believing I was the villain. But now, she saw the truth. "What about you?" I ask. "What happens next?" Madison hesitates. "I don't know," she admits. "I spent so long thinking my mother was invincible, that she was right about everything. Now?" She shakes her head. "I don't want to be anything like her." It's the first time she's said it out loud, the first time she's let herself break away. A knock at the door interrupts us. I glance up to see my father standing there, hesitant, uncomfortable, carrying years of unspoken apologies. "Do you have a minute?" he asks. Madison stands, smoothing her sweater, offering me a small nod before slipping out. And suddenly, it's just me and my father. "I owe you more than an apology," he says, settling into the chair Madison just left. "I owe you years, decades." I stay quiet. "I let her twist everything," he continues, staring at his hands. "I let her push you aside. I should have seen it. I should have—" He stops himself, exhaling shakily. "I failed you, Lauren." I swallow. This is the moment I had imagined so many times, the moment he finally saw me. "Yeah," I murmur, "you did." He nods, accepting it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he says, "but I'd like the chance to be your father again." I study his face. He looks old, tired. Not the man I remember from my childhood before my mother's death. Before Victoria stepped into our lives and rewrote our history, he isn't that man anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he can be something new. "It won't be easy," I tell him honestly. "I know. But we can start small." His shoulders sag with something like relief. "That's all I ask." That evening, I sit alone in my office, staring at a letter I had never opened before. My mother's handwriting is delicate, steady, untouched by time. I unfold the paper, my heart pounding. "I built this for you, Lauren. Not just the money, but the strength to fight for yourself. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." A breath shudders from my lips. She had known. She had always known. I place the letter in my drawer, my fingers lingering over the edges for a moment before shutting it away. I had won. Not just against Victoria, but against the fear that once held me back. And for the first time in my life, I was free. If there's one thing I've learned through this entire ordeal, it's this. No one can take away your worth unless you let them. For years, I allowed Victoria to dictate my place in this family. I allowed my father's silence to shape my doubts. I believed that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. But in the end, I realized something powerful. The only person who could truly fight for me was me. Many of us have been in situations where we felt unseen, unheard, or even betrayed by the people we trusted the most. It's easy to second-guess yourself when those around you try to rewrite the truth. But here's what I want you to remember. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And when the time comes, you have to be willing to stand your ground, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's terrifying. My mother left me more than just money. She left me a lesson in resilience, in self-worth, in never letting anyone take what is rightfully mine. I hope in some way this story reminds you to do the same. So tell me, Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when no one else would? Have you ever been gaslit into questioning your own reality? Let's talk about it in the comments. If this story resonated with you, drop a number 1 in the comments below or let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't agree with how things unfolded, I want to hear that too. What would you have done differently? If you enjoyed this video and it spoke to your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that challenges, inspires, and connects us all. Thank you for being here. Your story matters, and I'll see you in the next one.